This is your before and after story, where your first steps towards a new life-changing career begin. Southeastern College can take you there. We offer in-demand hybrid and online programs with hands-on training, led by in-field career professionals, and career services to put you on the path to a rewarding and fulfilling future. This is where your transformation begins. Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sec.edu to get started.
Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I'm Kate Carpenter, and in most episodes, I'm joined by a historian to talk about their research and writing craft. In today's show, I spoke with Dr. Judith Giesberg.
Thank you for having me, Kate. I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Giesberg is a historian and professor at Villanova University. She is the author of 6 books focused on the U.S. Civil War and its aftermath. She is also an active digital and public historian, and her newest book is the culmination of these interests. Inspired by an ongoing digital project, Last Seen, the enduring search for formerly enslaved people to find their lost families, draws on advertisements placed by formerly enslaved people after the Civil War, in some cases long after, attempting to find loved ones who had been stolen away from them when they were sold by enslavers. It's a fascinating book, at turns heartbreaking and inspiring, and I was truly delighted to get to ask Judy more about the project and her research process. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Judy Giesberg.
I kind of found myself, surprisingly, in the era of sort of Civil War and Reconstruction in graduate school, and the work that I've worked on since then has began kind of with elite white women who were working in soldier relief during the Civil War, and then moved to the urban North, where what I really had wanted to do for my dissertation, which is to understand how poor families and immigrants and people of color survived the war, which was my proposal for a dissertation. It was roundly rejected because it would be too hard and too difficult. But that's kind of where I've kept myself since then, and focused on the experiences of people in marginalized communities and how they survived the war. And then with this book, really, it's not really the urban North anymore. It really follows freed people wherever they wind up after the war, putting their families back together. But I include in that question about sort of the trajectory of my career as a writer, work I've done as an editor, which was super helpful to me, not only to sort of clarify what it is we do when we teach graduate students how to write, but also helping me to think through, my writing process. When I worked both as an editor of book reviews and then the editor of Journal of the Civil War Era for a number of years, and that was a really good project for me, thing for me to do, to think through some of what I do both as a writer and as a mentor for graduate students who are learning to write.
What kinds of things did that experience sort of change or teach you?
Yeah, it really, a number of things, I guess, sort of balancing between, respecting the sort of style and the voice of authors at the same time as trying to help them find the sort of, the most important thing that they're trying to say, and to make that come out clearly. And that can, sometimes when you're working, at least when I was working at editor, I'm sure other editors have other ways to do it. It felt to me, in some cases, like a longer term mentoring kind of relationship where you found an author who has a really great idea, but there's a lot of back and forth between you and the author. But then also sometimes I invited other people who were interested in the field and might sort of help an author, realize what it is that they most wanted to do with the piece. So it became for me a lesson in sort of in mentorship in addition to editing. Yeah. And then, the years I spent as a book review editor taught me a lot of stuff. It taught me, that is an art in and of itself. And it's not necessarily the case that people who are great writers and great scholars necessarily are really great at book reviewing. It also lent itself to lots of awkward, non-looks at conferences where people had a book review that was overdue and didn't want to engage me because I was the person that they were most sort of, that they were, that they felt guilty for missing their deadline. It was a great way for me to feel like I was familiar, to stay on top of everything, all the new books that were coming out and all the things that I, needed to read and wanted to read. It also was a lot of matchmaking to think about sort of who's the best person to review a book. And then it also just teaches you things about people who you thought you really knew. And then you learn something new, like a roommate, like, oh my God, I didn't really know that person was like that, because they'd send me a book review where I was like, wait a minute. It's like, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but it was a pleasure. I think anybody who's done it though would tell you that you can only do that for a few years. And then, it's time to move on, rotate that responsibility onto other people because it's a lot of work. Yeah. But I enjoyed it while I did it.
Let's talk a little bit about your own writing process. So when and where do you like to do your writing?
I like to do it right here. I'm sitting in my office, which is a converted garage in my house, which during the pandemic actually made it into an actual room as opposed to sort of a corner of a cold and unheated garage. Now it's got both heating and air, and it's got some paint on the walls. And I like working here in my office in my house. I'm kind of a late I fancy myself kind of early morning writer, but to be honest, I do my sort of best thinking and writing sort of between the hours of 10 and 3 with breaks in between. So I like to work right here, and I like to, and I do good work between 10 and 3. I think a long time ago, I used to be able to, I think when I have 3 children, 2 are in their late 20s. And when they were young, I used to be able, the older ones, when they were, and I have a teenager, but when the older ones were young, I would do such crazy things as like put them to bed and then sit down and write for a couple of hours, but that doesn't really work anymore. It's not really good. I could maybe edit something that I've written during the day, but to produce something that, or I can grade papers or write a letter of recommendation maybe at night, but my writing really has to take place sort of late morning into the afternoon.
Are you a kind of person who sets daily goals for yourself?
I have done that. I'm not a word counter so much as, I guess I set goals for what I'd like to accomplish in a day. If I can sort of, write through this one episode or this one kind of a problem in a day, then I feel like it's a good day. I have done it before sort of, and I even sort of share that advice that I've heard from other people. It's a great idea to sort of set yourself a word goal. And some of the people you've interviewed, I'm so impressed by them because they set these word goals. And I think it's really impressive. I don't do that. I really sort of think about it in the cases of, like I said, sort of what kind of piece of the story what do I want to tackle today? And if I'm really lucky, maybe I'll get, maybe I'll see the other side of it by the end of the day.
How do you like to organize yourself? Do you have tools that you use?
Several projects ago, I tried to adopt Zotero and then I gave up on it. So it's pretty old school. And again, I was really impressed by listening to other people answer this question. And I thought, oh my God, I need to really go back and rethink the way they do this because I'm really pretty old school. I have lots of Word files that I sort of separate by chapter and by kind of notes I'm taking from primary sources, notes I'm taking from secondary sources. This project, because it's built on an archive that I've worked on forever, it is there was some pre-organizing that occurred because of the work that we put into making sure that we have really good solid metadata on all of these advertisements. So that actually imposed a level of organization that I might not have had otherwise because of the archive on which it was built. But mostly my ways of organization are pretty old school, kind of spreadsheets. I have Word files. I sometimes, when I was writing this book, I started each chapter off by creating a timeline of events that I was able to put together based on sort of the fragmentary evidence of the various subjects in this book, which starts with this information wanted ad and then builds out. So I would create timelines in which I could sort of put together as much as I could think that I could get from various pieces of evidence, and then maps to try to sort of visualize their movements. And those, I post all over the walls and sort of keep track of their movements. And that helps me, when I'm not kind of sitting and looking through all my Word files and spreadsheets, I can look up and think about a map. I can look at a map and I can think about the timeline, and it'll helps me keep writing.
Where it may be a difficult question for this project, especially, but when in your research process do you like to start writing?
That's a good question. I guess this book, more than any of the others, each chapter itself is a narrative of one person who's trying to find their family members. Whereas other books, I might be sort of writing different pieces of it. And then, as I'm sort of working through the primary sources or the secondary sources and then putting it together, not in kind of a linear fashion, like this is the chapter I'm working on now. This one I really did, I really did sort of follow the same kind of process with each chapter. Like I said, the first thing I needed to do was make sure I had as much as I could figure out about each person's life based on the records I had. And once I had all, those maps and those timelines, I would then start writing. But like everybody else in this process, right, you never know what you need until you're writing, right? Which others of your guests have of course pointed out, and you yourself know, it was a lot of back and forth. Usually I would start after I had some sense of where I thought the story of this person's life was going to go. And then oftentimes sort of abruptly stop and realize I really needed to get more, right? I needed to find more from whatever archive I was consulting. This project too was different because I had kind of a list of people who had identified that I really wanted to tell their stories. And then I often found in about a third of the cases that I just didn't have enough confidence in what I could find. And so there were a lot of stories left out of this book because of just sort of the nature of sort of where they wound up after the war and what kind of, evidentiary base I could build a story on. So there are a lot of stories left out that I was really hoping that, I could get into the book.
Well, I feel like we're dancing around this. So let's talk a little bit about how this project originated, how it emerged. So it's connected to this digital project, which is also called Last Seen. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The Last Seen archive, we started it here at Villanova, just reading through microfilm of the Christian Recorder, which is a Black newspaper still published here at Mother Bethel here in Philadelphia back in 2016. And then the website went live 2017. And, at the time, we had identified these advertisements in that one newspaper and thought if we could make this archive available to genealogists and people who didn't have access to subscription databases at their libraries, at their universities, like I did, if we could make, the ads just from this one newspaper available free on a website for genealogists, then we would have done something worthwhile with these family stories. So all of them were harvested from microfilm, not from any online databases that you have to pay for. And so we, once we had about 700 or 800 of them, we started to talk to people here in Philadelphia and in some of the neighboring communities, in particular Black genealogy groups and just said, here is a website. We'd like you to know about it so you can use it for free. And it grew from there, because every time we talked to an audience, we thought we'd really stumbled on something that was, that people didn't know about, and a lot of people didn't know about it. But Black genealogists had this sort of, they always offered us advice, and they always thought they were sure that what we'd found in this one newspaper existed in many other newspapers. So when we talked to an audience, for instance, in Philadelphia, when we first started talking about the project, somebody stood up in the audience and said, "Have you looked at the Chicago Defender?" And at the time we thought we'd find a few hundred of these, and maybe for 20 or 30 years after the end of the Civil War, they existed. And of course, the Chicago Defender doesn't start publishing until the early 20th century. And that was sort of a moment when my students and I thought, this might be this project is bigger than one newspaper. And so we're closing in on around 5,000. We're right now at 4,713, I think I checked yesterday, advertisements from over 100 Black newspapers. And the archive, again, has been built in conversation with Black genealogy groups who have guided our development all the way. And the way that it is designed, if any of your readers have ever looked at it, has been very responsive to how it is that they use an archive like that. So how genealogists search for people and what kinds of features would help them to find people. So we have maps, as you probably as people might note, and we have ways, 5 or 6 different ways to identify advertisements for people who have only pieces of information about family members that they're looking for. So that's how the project began. That's the Last Seen project.
Awesome. I want to talk about the book in this podcast, but I also want to say that I spent some time with the website, and it's just such an incredible project. And I hope people listening will go check it out for themselves too. I am curious, how did working on that project, especially maybe how did going out in the community and talking to people shape what the book became?
It very much was shaped in that experience. So the question that we always get when we're out in the community talking about this project is, do we know if people found each other? And that's always the question that I never feel like I have a good answer for, right? My answer is always, I just don't know, or, we won't know unless we follow. The only way you might know that, the most obvious way, is sometimes people advertise that they found somebody. But that's pretty uncommon of the nearly, like I said, the more than 4,700 ads we have there. We have about 100 that talk about people finding each other. And some of those are in white newspapers, which we tag white newspapers because we want users to understand that a very small percentage of the ads there, were published in white newspapers. And we want them to know that, right, that you would approach those, that it makes sense to approach those differently. So the only way we would know is if they took out a follow-up advertisement, which seems unlikely to happen as often as we might want because you have to pay for an advertisement. Or if you follow them, right? If you sort of follow them through the extant sources and see if you might find, if you find the sort of holy grail, right? You find them in a census 10 years later, and lo and behold, those two people who were searching for one another wind up in the same census together. Or other kinds of evidence where you might find them together again. So I never really I never have a good answer for that. But because it's a website, we also not only get that question from people who we're talking to face, but we get user data, and those, few 100 ads that describe a reunion are by far the most popular advertisements on the site. People want to know how the story ends. So when I set about to write the book, I, decided that I would do that I would try to that I would follow 10 people in their search for their family members to find out how their story ended, or to get as close to it as I could. And I was very careful when I was pitching the book to my agent first, and then when I started working with my editor, to say that I chose 10 people without knowing if their story ended in success, because I didn't want to cook the books. I didn't want to put my thumb on the scale, and having spent so much time with these stories, it really strikes me that even when people found each other, that doesn't necessarily mean we have a happy, this sort of urge to have a happy ending, to me, is sort of, dangerously close to the way white newspapers like to cover the end of slavery, right? Like slavery was not that, the late 19th century newspapers, very much shaped by the lost cause, were all kind of like, slavery was this sort of awful thing, but it's over, it's done, and or it wasn't that bad, and it all ended happily, right? And so I was very conscious that the stories that I chose, I had to choose for my own reasons, and those I can explain later, but I didn't choose them knowing if there was going to be, if the ending was going to be a happy one. And it was very interesting, sort of back and forth, because, both my agent and my publisher, say stuff like, but you're not going to not tell the stories that ended happily. Like, you're not going to then really go the other way and like, oh no, if it ends happily, I won't do that. No, that's not what it was. It was really I was very conscious that I wanted this story to represent what I think we were seeing in the archive, which is a lot of people searching for a long time, and few of them registering success, at least registering success. So that's a very long way of answering your question. But from audiences, we clearly were hearing that they wanted to know how the story ended. And for sure, through our data that we're getting on the website, people really like the stories that end, with happy endings. And I get all of that. And so those things were sort of foremost on my mind, both working to help me think about the choices that I was making and be careful about how I told these stories and whose stories made it into the book.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. You talk about it a little in the book too, which is how I knew to ask. And I thought it was really interesting because we talk a lot on the show about sort of knowing your audience and what they might be looking for. And I appreciate that this is a reason to know your audience in terms of making sure you're not just giving what they want or sort of like falling into a trap. So I appreciate that too, right? There are lots of reasons to want to know your audience and what they're looking for in a book and how that affects you. You've written and edited actually several books, but this was your first one, as you just mentioned, with an agent and a non-university press. What was it that prompted you at this point to try that route?
Yeah, I thought this story I think it's likely because it originates with this website, right? Which is, really intended for an audience well beyond the academy and from the beginning and not really at touching the academy at all. And because so many of the stories told in the archive are stories that I talk about with people all over the country. And we work a lot with teachers and we're in classrooms. And it seemed to me a story that I really wanted the widest possible audience to engage with. And so for this book, I decided that I would try to do it this route. And it is very, very different from anything I've ever done before with the university press. I have to say, and of course, and everybody, all the other historians you've talked to know that it means that much of the peer review is work that you have to do, right? So with this book, I made sure that I workshopped chapters. I had a couple different writing groups with people who I trust with reading things like a peer reviewer would. And then I had the extraordinary pleasure of getting to work with Bob Bender at Simon & Schuster, who's just legendary and has edited some of my favorite books of history. And I trusted his, and his guidance from the very beginning. And it was a great honor to work with him. He's an old school editor, pencil, I got pages back in which he was, penciling things in. big X's scratching things out and moving things around and asking me to rethink things. And it was a great learning experience for me, and such an honor to get him to work with me on this. And it was crucial for me to there were a few things that I will take away from this. Like from Bob, I learned that where each of the stories I told in the book ended, which I didn't really know until I just kept writing and writing. I mean, I had the timeline, I had the maps, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote until I felt like I had, until I felt like I had put everything about this person into a chapter. But that wasn't really that wasn't really going to work for a reader. And Bob would come in and go, oh, no, your chapter ended about 6 pages ago, right? It was like, this is where this story ends. And I'm so grateful to him for doing that. It also meant that I think I mentioned this before, that, sometimes I was always fighting the urge, and not very well, of putting other people's stories in there, right? Like this story was comparable to this other person, and maybe I could put her in here and just sort of sneak her in here. And Bob's advice to me always was no, right? Really try to fight the urge to get those 2 or 3 other person's story into this chapter. So it was a very different kind of experience than the kind of university press experience where you send it out to readers, you get it back, and there's a bit back and forth. This was much more hands-on and much more back and forth.
So that we could talk in more concrete detail about some of her writing choices, I asked Judy to read an excerpt from her newest book. This passage comes from the start of chapter 4, following the search of a man named Henry Tibbs. Here's Dr. Judith Giesberg reading from Last Scene, the enduring search by formerly enslaved people to find their lost families.
Henry Tibbs wrote to the papers in search of his mother when he was 55 years old. Tibbs grew up without her in Mississippi, fought with the United States colored troops during the war, married, and had children of his own, all the while holding on to the details about the last time he saw his mother when he was a small child. A decade after the war, he wrote a letter to the paper inquiring about her. He described a series of sales or swaps that took the young boy away from his mother, sending him to New Orleans, the heart of the domestic slave trade, and then on to the Mississippi cotton fields. Scenes of young children being wrenched from their mother's arms were common in mid-century America. Foreign eyewitnesses reported on such incidences in their travel accounts. Abolitionists illustrated their tracts with shocking sketches of baby auctions, and in their published memoirs, formerly enslaved people relayed details about losing their mothers. There was nothing exceptional or unusual about what happened to Henry Tibbs. No laws effectively prohibiting the trafficking of young children like him away from their mothers. The laws protected the traffickers, men like those named in Tibbs's letter to the newspaper. When emancipation finally came, freed people's families were in disarray. Those who had managed to stay together before the war were separated when men and boys enlisted or were impressed into the army. And women, and those too old or too young to be militarily useful, made their way to refugee camps in abandoned plantations. As soon as they could, freed women and men sought out federal soldiers, local officials, pastors, missionaries, newspaper editors, employers, and neighbors for help finding their children. They went to the papers with everything they remembered and had gathered over the years, including physical descriptions that were eerily reminiscent of fugitive slave ads. Parents filled their ads with details about their children's faces and hands, information gleaned from watching them as they slept and holding their hands when they fell. A father looked for his son Isham, who was, quote, an albino, white-skinned but of Negro blood, with one black spot on his underlip. A mother wrote for her son William, who had, quote, a full mouth with very short white teeth, a scar on his forehead, just above his right eye. Someone might recognize a freedwoman's daughter, Martha, by the little piece chipped out of her right ear. Another mother hoped the same for her 7-year-old daughter, Sarah Frances, who was missing, quote, the index of the right hand. Each chipped ear or fist or missing finger marked a moment in a child's life that their parent recalled vividly, painfully. Children who were too young to know a name or recognize a place carried with them something, a scar perhaps, that might remind them of a father or a mother who had once comforted them. But when a child like Henry Tibbs was separated from his mother at a young age, he was left with little to begin his search, except the memory of that separation and maybe her efforts to prevent it. Children had fewer opportunities than adults to fill in the rough outlines of a lost loved one with new information gleaned over the years and transmitted via the grapevine telegraphs many miles. Their memories of lost mothers were frozen in time and could only with some difficulty and limited success be mobilized in the search for family lost to the domestic slave trade.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what went into writing this passage?
Each of the chapters, and this one included, begins with the advertisement that the subject of the chapter placed. And this advertisement, in this advertisement, Henry Tibbs, as I said in that passage, who's in his 50s when he writes it, describes the moment when he is in slave jail in Alexandria, and he cried to have his, he cried so much that the jailer agreed to bring his mother to him, and so his mother comes to the jail and brings him candy and cake. And the jailer asks, the jailer at some point in time, asks his mother to pick him up out of a lineup. And he sort of remembers this moment when his mother comes to the jail and knows him right away and gives him cake and candy so that he will, stop crying. It's a very emotional, when you read this advertisement, it's full of these wrenching emotions that you can imagine that both Henry and his mother were feeling at the time, knowing that they were to be separated. But it's also got this little sort of suggestion of this kind of heroic effort that that a parent would make. In this case, his mother sort of coming to this jail and bringing him some sweets to try to help her son get over this moment, or to sort of remember her sweetly, or to survive this awful experience. And that sort of little bit of heroism runs through a lot of advertisements that were placed by children who were separated from their parents. We could see that in a lot of the advertisements, actually, that are not necessarily even making it into the book, but parents who are going across swollen rivers to save their children who are about to be sold, or parent tying a tooth to a piece of string and tying it around their child's neck so that they could remember them. There's a lot of these sort of larger than life memories that live on in a child's heart and mind, that you can see these stories relayed in these advertisements. So when I was reading Henry Tibbs's advertisement, of course, again, I think I started this by sort of, saying that I tried to outline as much as I can find out about everybody in the ad and have those outlines, all over my walls and my maps. When there were children who were separated from the parents, the information that a lot of them were able to place in the ads are almost impossible to, it's really, really hard to find the people in advertisements, oftentimes taken out by children in particular, because they're only, if they remember any names at all, they would be just a first name, sometimes of a parent. And sometimes the place names were very difficult to sort of find locations that even carried those names anymore. So the information is very piecemeal, but that's sort of balanced by these really vivid memories of parents just trying to do whatever they could to help their children. And so when I started to write about Henry Tibbs, I was thinking a lot about that, about what it meant to sort of live through that trauma at a young age. And of course, Tibbs' story, not to give too much of it away, when he serves in the army, he's also, right, he's sort of having other experiences that we might think of as traumatic, as pretty traumatic experiences. And then he sits down after all of that to relay this story. And what does it mean for a person, right, to hold on to all of these memories for this long and to try to put them down to paper? And how much of this can be used by descendants of people like, Henry Tibbs's own descendants? How much of this can we as historians use to sort of try to tell his story? And how much of it can we just sort of think about as an act of memory, right? Like that this is a way for him to remember people, even if even if the information in it was not necessarily going to yield a result for those of us today who are trying to find out the rest of his story.
I mean, as this reminds us, like it takes incredible research, challenging research to try to put together these stories to tell them in the book. And of course, you couldn't find everything that you would hope to. What were your strategies for sort of filling those gaps or writing around those gaps?
Yeah. So, the first thing that I mentioned before is that sometimes I just felt like I couldn't. The gaps were bigger than, right. So I left a lot of stories out, which was part of the struggle between knowing when a story would end, because I always was like, well, wait a minute, maybe I can just kind of sneak in that person that, like, maybe this is a point where I don't want to just leave them totally out of the story. Maybe I can just sneak them in here. But to fill in the gaps, each story started with these advertisements, and then I had to be able, in order to even begin to tell their story, I had to be able to find people in the advertisement in a census or two, just to start with, so that I could find, that I could kind of anchor them in a time and a place. And then from there, I built out to see what other kinds of sources I could find in government records and in pension files or in local news coverage or anything. And then with the gaps, I relied quite a lot on some of the extraordinary work done by other scholars of slavery, who talk a lot about archives and what we can and can't do with them, and how we have to think kind of imaginatively and empathetically around its limitations. I'm inspired by Taya Miles' work, right, on sort of the material culture of slavery and sort of memories and things like that. And I was thinking, I was just catching up on Thavolia Glimp's AHA talk that she gave, and she talked about she described the archive as much as boisterous and loud, right? We sort of have to remember that when people talk about this, it is a sort of counter to the silence of the archive. What she finds in it is a lot of sound, right, and a lot of potential for telling stories. And those things, I inspired and guided by those. And then I also, used published memoirs of enslaved people who escaped from the different places that I was researching. I relied with some of the later stories on Isabella Wilkerson's stuff about about these sort of communities of, that began the Great Migration. That was useful and very inspiring to me, especially since some of these people wind up in places like New Jersey and Illinois and Michigan. And so I relied a lot on all this extraordinary work that was done before this project. And then just sort of trying to seeing within these sources the potential to at least sort of think about how things like trauma works to sort of shape memories or limit memories or predict the way people are sort of wrestling with their past. So there was a lot going on in that answer, Kate. I don't know if any of it made any sense, but I read a lot of things written by a lot of really smart people, and use those things as best I can to fill in the blanks. But as I suggested, sometimes the blanks were too big, and so stories just didn't make it in there. But they're living on the archive, and maybe somebody else who's better than I am at this will pick up some of those stories that I had to leave behind. So
Obviously, you've talked about how you needed to be able to have enough there that you could write about people. What other factors influenced who you chose to include in the book?
I wanted, first and foremost, one of the things I did was we had about 4,000 advertisements in the archive when I started to write. That's how long it took me. We're we're almost 1,000 beyond that. That's a long time. It took a long time to get this out. So I started by doing kind of just looking at the data on the archive to see what are the most representative kinds of advertisements. So who are the most likely people who are advertising and for whom? So I wanted it to be representative of the archive. And so the most common some of the most common searchers are mothers looking for their children and children looking for their mothers, also fathers, and then siblings were either children looking for their parents or children looking for each other were, heavily represented in the archive. So the choices that I made were based on the most common searches. So I sort of sorted the archive based on the most common kinds of searches. And those were the ways I organized the chapters. But I also wanted to get in there some that are numerically not as significant, but also, show the potential for learning something about this generation. So there's a chapter in there on veterans, right, who are looking for one another. So U.S. colored troop veterans who want to find one another, oftentimes for help with pensions, and their widows too. So that was the first criteria was, what represented the most common kinds of searches that we found in this archive. And then I also, one of the features on the website is the map that shows you where people are searching from, which is really surprising. They're searching from, some of it's not surprising, right? The concentration on the Eastern Seaboard, but really, people are searching throughout the country and even outside of the country. And so I wanted the advertisements to represent some of that or capture some of that geographic diversity. So I wanted people to be coming from both the East Coast and the West Coast, obviously the Mississippi Valley. And I wanted stories from, the Midwest as best I could. So the choices that I made were based both on geographic diversity and then the most common searches. And so I had several choices for each of those categories, and then I would start to dig.
I'd like to ask, there's a line in the acknowledgments that I'm hoping you'll be up for talking about a little. And I know that this is a far more nuanced discussion probably than we can cover in a podcast, but I'm always interested in how historians think about this question. So you say, quote, "I wasn't sure this was my book to write, but I do know that it was important to try, because if we don't try to see this history through these subjects' eyes, we will be doomed to continue repeating it." Can you talk a little bit more about how you kind of thought of this question of whether something was your history to write?
Sure. And this is also something that I feel very much as I've gone around working on the archive and working with Black genealogy groups, that all this is this is all very personal. Genealogists are they're often looking for their own family members, right? They're not, they could be professional genealogists, right, working on other people's genealogy, but they're also always also thinking of this in the very deeply personal terms of wanting their family tree to be filled out, right? To find their people. And so, I understand very much that my own family's history is a different one, right? My family came to this country as refugees from the Nazis, and there are holes in my family's history that were created from that experience, and that is sort of my truth and my family's history. Yet the work that I'm doing is about people's family histories that are not mine, and so I understand that each person who I'm profiling in the book is, could very likely have descendants who are alive today. And this is their story more than it is, than it is anybody else's, including my own. And so something that my editor and I talked about several times was, did you find descendants of these people living today, which is work that I didn't do. And I am not trained as a genealogist. I consulted with genealogists as I was writing this, but I didn't do that work. And I'm keenly aware that that is likely the case. There are people who actually know people and, who are related to or who know people in the book, or who might know these names, because that strikes me every time we're talking. And I'll say, here's the website. And I start projecting ads and somebody raises their hand and said, wait a minute, I'm from that town. And that name sounds familiar. And then the conversation, sort of like the ads were supposed to work, the conversation then evolves into like, those are my people. And so I'm aware that this is not my family's history. But I also feel like when I was working on this project, I was very keenly aware that people do want to know more about the story. And if I could, stories of these individuals, and if I could spend the time trying to find at least 10 of these stories, then I would hope to draw more attention to the work that genealogists do, and the potential for a lot of people to tell their own stories and other stories from this archive. So when I was writing that, I'm keenly aware of that, and also right that's operating on the very forefront of my mind as I'm writing the book. This is not something that I am going to pretend to feel in that very deeply personal way that I might if these were people who I could rightfully claim as my people.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little. For the last bit of our time, I'd like to hear a little bit about your own inspirations. So are there specific writers or books that you turn to for inspiration for your writing?
Yeah, that varies from time to time. For this book, and I haven't had enough distance from this book yet to start to think beyond it. So the answers will be very, very much about right now, and very much what people I've been reading again a lot. And I mentioned her before, but Taya Miles' book, All That They Carried, and I just love the way she writes all of her stuff that she writes. And I think that book in particular was really inspiring to me. And then Ilyan Wu's book on William and Henry Craft, Master Slave, Husband Wife. Her writing in that book was amazing. She wins the Pulitzer for that. It's beautiful, and the way that she brings these characters to life, and I find her writing to be really inspirational. Those are a couple of people who I've turned to repeatedly as I was writing this, in hopes that I could absorb some of that, amazing creative writing that they do, or the way in which they bring their characters to life. So those are a couple of people. And I've sadly deprived myself of fiction. So I have to say I'm just kind of sticking with the nonfiction right now. But I do like to read some fiction too. And hopefully now that this book is out, I can catch up on some fiction reading as well. So I'll get good advice from I've been listening to your interviews, and I'm getting some good advice about some fiction reading to catch up on. So
what's the best writing advice you've ever gotten?
The old, like, butt in the chair, right? Sit down and just, and write. And it's not, and it might be ugly. And oftentimes it is ugly. Right. But it's words on a page, and words on a page are better than no words on a page. So, the best advice I ever got was, you sit your butt down and you write, right? And then, and when you think you're done, you write some more. Again, it might not be pretty, but it's better than a day of writing is better than, a day of struggling to get your words perfect.
Well, I know you just said that with Last Scene just coming out, you have not had a chance to even think beyond it, which is perfectly reasonable. But I'm curious, how do you think about next projects? How will you go about thinking about what comes next?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it always seems like I go through this period of, oh my God, I'm never doing another thing again. That was way too hard. I just feel like, no, I don't know about you, but especially usually when you sort of are getting kind of tired and you realize you still have about half of the book left to do, you're like, this is it. I'm never going to write another thing again. And then not too long after something comes out, you start to, you forget that, and you start to find stories that you came across as you were, writing, that you wanted to come back to, or just conversations with friends and things that you discovered in the archive that you want to come back to. So I don't know, a couple of colleagues and myself we've long wanted to look at the experiences we had started this conversation about looking at soldiers in the Union Army who were charged with sodomy, to sort of see if we could understand what that means and what kinds of culture was going on in Union Army camps. And this is a conversation we've been having for decades, and I don't know if we'll ever get around to doing it, but in the process, we were looking for images of young soldiers and camp servants. So these were young Black boys who wound up serving in the Union Army. And some of these images are extraordinary, and they seem to be sort of crying out for kind of a conversation about, and these were all from these were all from Union regiments. So there's this very interesting kind of dynamic between Union soldiers and young Black boys and young men that really, that kind of got my attention. And I think maybe hopefully we'll get back together, these colleagues of mine and I, to retackle these experiences within Army camps, not only of sort of same-sex relationships, but also these very young boys who are winding up in some of these camps, and what is their experience like, and what can it tell us really about the culture of the urban North and race relations. And so that's one thing that is kind of there, but maybe not right away. I have to talk myself into that writing advice, right? That I was just sharing, right? That means you got to sit in your chair, you got to write the words. So
maybe it's okay to get out of the chair for a little while.
I think so. Yeah, I think I'm going to stand up and get out of the chair a little bit, and then we'll see. So, and read some of the good stuff that I haven't, some of the stuff I haven't gotten to read. So,
well, Dr. Judith Giesberg, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past.
Oh, thank you, Kate. This was a great pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Drafting the Past. To find links to the books we talked about and a transcript of this episode, along with past episodes, visit draftingthepast.com. There you can also sign up for the newsletter to stay up to date on new episodes and other history writing news. Until next time, I'm host and producer Kate Carpenter, reminding you that friends don't let friends write boring history.